This is Update One, the podcast of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Update One provides a forum for listeners to learn about national and international stories, focusing on journalism and communication issues, news, and politics. Now, the latest edition of Update One.
I'm Adam Konowe, and joining me today to discuss press freedom is John Donnelly. He is chair of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Team and a journalist at CQ Roll Call. John, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Next Monday, May 3rd, is World Press Freedom Day. Before we get into how the National Press Club will be marking it, can you talk a little more about the event in general?
Yeah, World Press Freedom Day is actually 30 years old on this Monday, May 3rd. And it's under the auspices of the United Nations, UNESCO. There's an annual conference, and then there's regional conferences, and it's just, it basically occurs mainly on social media now. It's a reminder to governments of the importance of information. Information is a public good is the slogan this year. It's a day of reflection for those of us in the press and an opportunity to spotlight cases where journalists are under assault. So it's all those things.
And not surprisingly, this year's event is largely virtual, but that doesn't mean that the Press Club is any less focused on press freedom and the cases of three journalists in particular that we're focusing on for this event. Yeah, so let's start first with Austin Tice.
Okay, well, Austin Tice, for those who may not recall or know, is being held captive in Syria right now. He was a freelance journalist. He did work for McClatchy and other news organizations and photographer. He was a Georgetown University law student and a former Marine who just went to Syria to help cover the crisis there. And in 2012, he went missing, and he's been missing since. He's a young man from Texas. He was 31 at the time of his disappearance. And the Press Club has been campaigning tirelessly to keep the spotlight on his case and keep the pressure on authorities here and in Syria to try to do something about it and try to bring him home, including, for example, letters to members of Congress and to the president, including just a few weeks back. We sent letters to 80 lawmakers, signed a letter, and 1,600 citizens. Now, on Monday, May 3rd, the Press Club president, Lisa Matthews, is doing an interview. It's an interesting new approach to the issue, an interview with Austin's 11-year-old niece, Maya, to get her recollections of him and what she's been doing to help free Austin Tice, and that's the hashtag. It's hashtag free Austin Tice. Sometimes we talk about these cases as if they're abstractions, but they're real people with families, and hopefully our interview with young Maya will help bring that to the fore.
Another name, one that a lot of journalists will recognize, Maria Ressa. Tell us about her plight.
Austin Tice is the winner of one of our John Aubuchon Press Freedom Awards, which we give every year, and so is Maria Ressa. We gave her the honor last year. She is a Princeton-educated journalist who worked for CNN in the Philippines, and now she's the CEO and co-founder of Rappler, which is a news organization in the Philippines. And her situation is that she has been under constant legal harassment by the Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte, because she has been covering him so relentlessly. She was convicted in 2020 of something called cyber libel, which is a phony charge. And she's giving a speech that is going to be webcast on the Press Club site on May 3rd. So her case is one that has been very much in the news, and she continues to face nothing but grief from the Philippine president.
And the third name, another one that sadly has become very familiar to many of us, Emilio Gutierrez-Soto.
Yes, Emilio Gutierrez-Soto is a journalist from Mexico, and he sought refuge in the United States in 2008. He had been covering the drug cartels and corruption in the Mexican military, and they didn't take very kindly to that. They raided his home on the phony pretext of a drug raid and seized his documents, and he saw that he had no choice but to flee for his life. Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. And so in 2008, he legally entered the United States and sought asylum. And 13 years later, he's still caught in a kind of Kafka-esque labyrinthine legal limbo. And we have been by his side, as it were, pretty much since he got here, trying to help him out. He's been denied asylum. He has appealed that decision, and that case is still pending. But 13 years, and this is somebody who he's clearly a journalist. His life was clearly in danger, and he has something to contribute here in the United States too. He's actually he has been a fellow at the University of Michigan in journalism, and we're doing a podcast interview where I am moderating a discussion involving Lynette Clementson, who runs the journalism center there in the University of Michigan, and also Kathy Kiley, who was a Press Freedom Fellow at the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Now she's a professor at the University of Missouri. Those two women have been, I would say, Emilio's biggest advocates, and along with some other folks at the press club. So we got to talk about his case and get into just one outrage after another. And one of the takeaways is if somebody like Emilio, who has the support of multiple journalism organizations, who's a fellow at the University of Michigan, he has legal representation. If he has to go through 13 years of legal hell, imagine what happens to somebody who has far less, help. And there's plenty of people like that. So it's an example of how the immigration system's messed up too.
Yeah, and I think back to the case of Jason Rezaian a number of years ago, where the National Press Club was very involved. In fact, I remember taking part in a 24-hour reading of his work to help bring his case to light and his illegal detention in Iran. These are all individual cases, and as you said, these are all people with friends and family, and not just names on a piece of paper. Anyone else at this point that you wanted to highlight?
Those are the three people that we are going to be talking about on Monday. I would also bring up the case of Asif Sultan, who's another winner of our Aubuchon honor. I hate to call it an award. It's a recognition of people who have done their jobs in the face of extreme adversity. Asif Sultan has been jailed since 2018 in Kashmir as part of a crackdown there. And he remains incarcerated, and that is a particularly outrageous case too. And of course, the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist from Saudi Arabia, who was killed by Saudi thugs at a consulate in Turkey. We have continued to repeatedly spotlight that case. So there are others that maybe will come up as we talk here this morning.
Yeah, sadly, a lot of names and in a lot of cases high profile, especially Khashoggi. Any way to quantify the level of reduced press freedom that seems to be occurring in a lot of parts of the world, and not just places where one might normally expect to see it?
Yeah, that's an important question, because yes, you see it. You see press repression, in China and Iran and Russia and places like that. But you also see it in places like Germany, where reporters have been physically attacked, and Poland and Hungary, countries that after the Cold War, after the the wall fell. We all were hopeful would become, free enterprise, democratic systems. But now Poland and Hungary are autocratic regimes where free press is being snuffed out left and right. There's a lot of bad news going on in terms of that, the situation for press freedom around the world. The Reporters Without Borders organization does an annual survey of world press freedom, and their most recent one says that the situation is the worst it's been since 2013. In 73 of 180 countries, the press is either totally blocked or seriously impeded by their standards. In 59 of their countries, the press is constrained. So 73% of the countries that they've looked at are in press freedom situations that are far from ideal, and that's not good. The coronavirus has been used as an excuse to crack down on reporters. And just like after 9/11, terrorism was used by governments as an excuse to crack down on coverage that they didn't like. And here's another statistic that I find particularly worrisome. 59% of respondents in a recent poll in 28 countries said that they believe that journalists lie, basically. 59% of respondents. That's not good. So, there is plenty to be alarmed about, and all the more reason for organizations like the National Press Club to keep the spotlight on overall trends and the individual people, like we've been talking about here today, who's, kind of put a face on the problem.
Yeah, and I want to talk about fake news and all of that in a little bit. And at the risk of making this somewhat personal, you've not only called out improper behavior towards the press, but in fact, you yourself were unjustifiably manhandled by some guards at the Federal Communications Commission 4 years ago. Seems like ancient history now, but tell us about that.
I don't usually cover the FCC, and I guess they didn't know who I was, but that was not a very good excuse for doing what they did. I tried to ask a question of a commissioner, and he walked past and didn't answer it, but I guess they didn't like that I asked the question, and they backed me up against a wall very forcefully. And then they forced me to leave the premises. And they later said in a letter to senators that I had been trying to access secure areas, which was completely false or a misreading at best. I was, at one point I turned in the wrong direction, but I was quickly corrected. But there was no reason to believe that I was doing anything sinister there. And I just think it was kind of a couple of out of control kind of mall cop types who just, overreacted. But, it happens all the time. There's a stat that in 2020, at least 400 journalists were attacked in the United States, physically attacked. And there were 137 arrests of journalists. And that's in America in 1 year. And so it happens far, far too often.
Very closely related to that, just yesterday, the National Press Club joined a number of other media-related organizations in urging Attorney General Merrick Garland and the Department of Justice to investigate the use of force against journalists, specifically in Louisville and Minneapolis, as potential civil rights abuses. Remind us what happened there and when, and plus what's really at stake here.
Those cities, among others, have a pretty bad track record when it comes to dealing with protesters and with reporters covering protests. Of the 137 arrests in 2020 that I mentioned, 20 were in Minneapolis and 3 were in Louisville. There was recently, just about a week or two ago, after the fatal police shooting of Dante Wright, there were several reporters that were either beaten or arrested or sprayed with chemical irritants. So much so that the Press Club and others issued statements about it. Again, these are cases where people identify themselves as journalists who are clearly recognizable as journalists, and yet they're still attacked. One of our recent Aubuchon winners is a woman named Linda Tirado, who lost vision in one of her eyes because she was hit by a policeman's rubber bullet during the George Floyd protests in 2020 in Minneapolis. In 2008, I was there at the Republican convention in the Twin Cities, and I saw how the police acted there. And they didn't make any distinctions between peaceful protesters, violent protesters, reporters. They penned everybody up, and they treated everybody with the same batons and sprays. And so what we're saying this week, along with 90 plus other media organizations, is hey, if you're probing civil rights abuses in those police departments, we hope and expect that you will take a look at how they're treating journalists who are, after all, it's worth repeating, performing their jobs and performing a constitutionally protected duty to inform the American people.
It's ironic that while the media are trying to cover issues of civil rights, the most basic civil right is being violated.
Exactly.
These attacks, real and online, on journalists just seem to continue here and abroad. I understand that there are allegations coming out of China, for example, that government went so far as to create a fake French journalist as a cover for state propaganda, I believe related to generating some coverage that was positive about China's involvement with its Uyghur community compared to the very harsh Western criticism. What does it say when we've come to a point where fake news isn't bad enough? We need to have fake journalists too.
Well, that's well said. And that case is particularly egregious, and it illustrates the lengths or the depths that autocratic regimes will go to. And we are entering an era where, we have fake videos and fake voice technology. We see obviously every day computer controls on Twitter, not controls, but trolls on Twitter, people whose identity is, hard to determine. But lots of these people are just, created in factories in Russia, basically. And they are having an influence on our domestic debates. And it seems like they have helped. They're not the sole cause, but they've helped divide Americans from each other. That's kind of their objective. But yeah, it's part of a larger trend of falsehood and lies and corruption, and the recognition that truth is the enemy of some of these despots, and so they go after it with every tool in their kit.
Yeah, and add that on top of the economic pressures that journalism was under well before the pandemic or the previous presidential administration or anything else, and it's certainly been a challenging place for the truth to come out. Try to end on a positive note for listeners of this podcast who want to help do the right thing. What does that behavior look like now in terms of trying to help rebuild the state of truth?
It's such a hard question, and I don't think it's one that's going to be answered simply or quickly, because I think we're in a world of hurt. I wish I could end it on a positive note, but we see that I mentioned the statistic of people who mistrust the press. You have misunderstanding of the role of the media. People don't really get that journalists are, for the most part, interested in providing as objective information as possible, and that it's not helped when you have news organizations that are ideological. That are dedicated to slanting the news, like Fox News and MSNBC, so it's getting bad, and it's not going to be like some kind of silver bullet that solves it. I don't think. It's just we as reporters, it's incumbent on us to do our jobs even better, because every misstep we have can be pointed to and can help those who are trying to undermine journalism. And that was really, Donald Trump's objective was to question not just journalists, but as Marty Barron, the former editor of the Post, put it, all independent arbiters of objective fact, right? Scientists, judges, journalists, the people that traditionally Americans turn to get the straight dope on things. He systematically went about questioning them, and a lot of people, for that went along with his argument. So, I mean, I think, the answer to your question is we have to keep doing our jobs and do it even better than before. We have to help educate the American public and the global citizenry about the role of journalism. And we have to push back against regimes, dictators, and even here in the United States, democratically elected politicians who, do not have the public's interest at heart. And finally, we need to keep the spotlight on some of these individual cases because that helps humanize and draw attention to the overall problem.
Yeah, I think all of that comes down to rigor and determination, right? I mean, there is no easy solution, but you need both of those things to get there. John, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
John Donnelly is chair of the National Press Club's Press Freedom Team. You can learn more about World Press Freedom Day at press.org. Click on upcoming club events under the calendar tab. I'm Adam Konowe. Thanks again for listening.
Update 1 is a production of the National Press Club's Broadcast Podcast Committee. You can comment on this podcast or any episode of Update 1 by sending an email to update1podcast. That's update, 1 podcast @gmail.com. Thanks for listening to Update 1.